In 3 years, Grace O'Coffer never missed a second. At 5:45 a.m., the tea was hot, the curtains were drawn, the world was in order. But this morning, the clock read 5:47, and for the first time in my life, I am standing in a house that has forgotten how to breathe. She didn't just leave a resignation letter. She left a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight into a corporate bloodbath. She wasn't just my maid, she was a ghost haunting my halls, using my name as a shield while she dismantled an empire from the inside. Now the hunters are closing in, and they don't realize that Grace isn't the only one they have to worry about. I don't just want my tea back, I want the woman who had the audacity to make me need her. If you're ready for a story where loyalty is a lie and obsession is the only truth, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's dive in. The clock on the kitchen wall read 5:47 in the morning when Saiwan first felt it. That particular quality of silence that does not comfort but instead presses against the skin like something unseen and waiting. He had lived in this estate for 11 years. He knew every sound it made before dawn. The low hum of the industrial refrigerator in the east kitchen, the soft click of the hallway thermostat adjusting to the morning temperature, the barely audible movement of feet that never hurried and never stumbled. He knew the estate the way a man knows his own heartbeat, not by thinking about it, but by noticing immediately when it changes. This morning, it had changed. He stood at the top of the grand staircase in a slate gray robe, one hand resting on the banister, and listened. The refrigerator hummed. The thermostat clicked, but the feet, those soft, precise, unhurried feet that had traced the same path through his corridors every morning for 3 years, were absent. The absence was not loud. It announced itself the way a missing word announces itself in the middle of a familiar sentence. You do not hear the gap, you feel it. Saiwan descended the staircase slowly, each step measured, his face carrying the same expression it always carried, which is to say, no expression at all. He moved through the corridor toward the main sitting room, where the curtains should have already been drawn open to let in the gray morning light. They were not. The room was still dimmed in the blue dark of early morning, the curtains heavy and closed, the room holding its breath the way rooms do when no one has touched them yet. He continued to the kitchen. The green tea was not prepared. The ceramic cup that sat on the counter every morning at precisely 5:45, filled, covered with a small saucer to hold the warmth, placed 3 inches from the edge of the counter on the left side, always the left, was empty, upturned, still in the drying rack from the previous night, as though the morning had not yet agreed to begin. Siwon stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Around him, 2 junior staff members moved with the careful, wide-eyed energy of people who sense that something is different but do not yet know what to do about it. Neither of them spoke to him. They understood, by instinct or by survival, that this was not the moment for words. He turned and walked to his study. On his desk, positioned at the center with a precision that told him immediately it had been placed deliberately and not forgotten, was a white envelope, slim, sealed, his name written on the front in handwriting he recognized before he had fully registered that he recognized it. Neat, careful letters that leaned ever so slightly to the right, as though in a hurry to say something important, but disciplined enough to slow down and say it properly. He sat down. He did not reach for the envelope immediately. He placed both hands flat on the desk on either side of it and looked at it the way a man looks at something he already knows will rearrange him and is deciding whether he is ready. Then he picked it up, broke the seal, and removed a single sheet of folded paper. The letter was 1 paragraph. It was written in the same careful hand. Mr. John, I am tendering my resignation effective immediately. I apologize for the abruptness of my departure and for any inconvenience this may cause the household. I am grateful for the opportunity to have served. I wish you and the estate well. Grace A. Okafor. He read it once, Then he read it again, not because he had not understood it the first time, but because some part of him was searching between the lines for something more, an explanation, a clue, a thread he could pull. There was nothing more, just those 5 precise sentences and her name written at the bottom like a door closing quietly behind her. John Si-won set the letter down on the desk. He did not crumple it. He did not stand abruptly or summon anyone or reach for his phone. He sat very still in his chair in the gray morning light of a room whose curtains had not been drawn, and he felt something move through him that he did not have an immediate name for. It was not anger. He knew anger well enough to recognize its texture. It was not confusion exactly, though there was confusion somewhere inside it. It was closer to the sensation of reaching for something that has always been there and finding only air, the specific disorientation of an absence that your body was not warned about. He had built an empire on the principle that nothing happened without his knowledge and nothing ended without his decision. Contracts did not dissolve, arrangements did not unravel. People did not simply leave. And yet, he reached for the ceramic cup that was not there, his hand moving out of 3 years of morning habit before his mind caught up with the reality. His fingers closed around nothing. He looked at his empty hand for a moment, then set it down on the desk beside the letter, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, John Si-won sat inside a silence that he had not chosen and did not know how to end. Outside, the morning was beginning to happen without permission, gray light pressing at the edges of the drawn curtains, the city waking somewhere beyond the estate walls. Inside, the green tea was cold water in a rack, the curtains were closed, and Grace Daisy Okafor was already gone. He did not call for Park Jun-ho until after 9. In those hours between the discovery of the letter and the moment he finally reached for his phone, Si-won did something he almost never did. He moved through his own estate like a visitor, slowly, without purpose, as though he were seeing rooms he had somehow stopped looking at. He walked through the east corridor where the staff quarters connected to the main house, through the formal dining room that was used perhaps 4 times a year, through the long gallery lined with art he had acquired because acquiring things was a language he spoke fluently. He was not searching. He did not tell himself he was searching, but his eyes moved differently than they usually did, slower, lower, catching details at the level at which a person who spent their days caring for a space would naturally exist. He noticed things. In the dining room, the chairs were pushed in at identical angles, not the approximate uniformity that any attentive staff member would manage, but a precise, deliberate uniformity. Each chair rotated to exactly the same degree. He had eaten in that room 100 times and never once noticed. In the gallery, the small bronze figurine on the 3rd display shelf had been repositioned, moved perhaps 4 centimeters to the left of where he had placed it 2 years ago, to correct an asymmetry in the arrangement that he himself had never seen, but that apparently had been quietly, correctly addressed without a word. In the library, and this was where he stood the longest, his books had been reorganized. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but he knew his library, and he could see now that at some point in the last 3 years, someone had taken every volume of every shelf, dusted each one individually, and returned them, not in the original order he had loosely maintained, but in a system, a considered, intelligent system that grouped by subject first, then by geography, then by era, so that a man who spent his life thinking in terms of patterns and strategy could now move through his own shelves with an intuition he hadn't earned, but had simply been given, quietly, without acknowledgement, without a single word. He stood in the library for a long time. There was a particular quality to Grace Okafor's work that he understood now, in her absence, that he had never fully articulated to himself while she was present. She did not perform efficiency, she embodied it. She did not manage the estate the way a person manages something assigned to them. She managed it the way a person cares for something they have quietly claimed as their own responsibility. There was no task too small and no detail beneath her attention, and crucially, she had done all of it without ever drawing attention to herself. 3 years, Not once had she come to him with a complaint, a request for recognition, an inventory of everything she had improved. She simply improved it and moved on to the next thing.
He had employed dozens of people across his various operations. He understood performance. He could identify, within 10 minutes of an interaction, whether a person was working for reward or working from character. Grace Okafor, he now understood with a clarity that arrived too late, had been the rarest kind, the kind who worked from something that had nothing to do with him at all. He returned to his study at 8:53 and sat down at his desk. The resignation letter was still there. He had not moved it. He looked at it for a moment, then picked up his phone and called Junho. Park Junho arrived within 7 minutes, which was standard. He was 31 years old, composed, and had worked beside Saiwon long enough to understand that the space between a request and its execution should be as short as possible. He entered the study, noted the letter on the desk, noted the uncustomary stillness of the room, and waited. Grace Okafor, Saiwon said, head maid. She left this morning. Junho nodded once, already calibrating. I want to know where she is. Not her family contacts, not her employment history. I have those. I want to know where she physically is, right now, and where she has been in the last 72 hours. Quietly. Do not alarm anyone in the household, and do not approach her if she is found. There was a brief pause, the kind Junho permitted himself only when precision mattered. Understood. Any particular urgency? Saiwon looked at him. You're still standing here. Junho left. Alone again, Saiwon turned his chair to face the window. The curtains in the study, at least, had been drawn. One of the junior staff had finally managed it, though later than usual and without the particular quality of light management that Grace seemed to intuitively understand. Curtains drawn to exactly the angle that let light fill the room without glare, adjusted by season, by weather, by the position of the morning sun. Today, they had simply been pulled open. The light came in flat and indifferent. He thought about the letter again. Not its content, which he had already memorized in the way his mind memorized everything it was shown, but its texture, the restraint of it. 5 sentences to end 3 years. No anger, no grievance, no explanation. Just a clean, quiet exit, the same way she had done everything else. It told him something he was only beginning to understand, that whatever Grace Adeze Okafor had left behind, she had not left carelessly. Every word in that letter had been chosen. Every word that was absent had been chosen too. She was not running, or rather, she was running, but she was running in the way that very deliberate people run. Not in panic, in preparation. The question that sat at the center of his chest for the rest of that morning, quiet and insistent, was not where she had gone. It was why she had gone now. 3 years of absolute reliability, and then one morning, gone. Something had changed, something had reached its moment, and Grace Adeze Okafor, efficient and invisible and careful as she had always been, had moved before it arrived. He simply did not yet know what it was. Junho returned at 2:30 in the afternoon with the particular expression he wore when he had found something but was not yet certain what it meant. Siwant had learned to read that expression over the years the way you learn to read weather, not by what it showed, but by what it was carefully not showing. He set down the documents he had been reviewing and waited. She was in Mapogu, Junho said, taking his position across the desk without being invited to sit, which was their custom. A furnished apartment on the 4th floor of a building near the river, small, monthly rental, paid 3 months in advance in cash. The landlord says she moved in 6 weeks ago. Siwan absorbed this without changing his expression. 6 weeks ago, which meant that Grace had not made this decision the morning she left. She had been preparing it, quietly, methodically, in the same way she prepared everything for at least 6 weeks before she placed that envelope on his desk. The letter had not been an impulse, it had been a conclusion. She's no longer there, Junho said, taking his position across the desk without being invited to sit, which was their custom. Cleared out sometime between last night and this morning. Landlord didn't see her leave. A neighbor heard movement around 3 in the morning but assumed it was nothing. By the time we arrived, the room was empty. Almost. It was the almost that shifted the air in the room.
Junho reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and removed a photograph, holding it by the edges with the careful habit of a man trained not to disturb what he handles. He set it on the desk facing Siwon. It was a standard print, slightly worn at one corner, the kind of photograph that had been handled many times over many months, carried, looked at, returned to a pocket or a drawer, carried again. In it, a younger Grace stood in a hospital corridor. She was perhaps 22 or 23, dressed simply, her hair pulled back. Beside her stood an older man, Nigerian, broad-shouldered, with a face that carried the particular gravity of someone who had spent a long time worrying about something specific. He had one hand on Grace's shoulder. They were not smiling. They were looking at the camera the way people look at things they are trying to remember. Siwon turned the photograph over. On the back, written in pencil, in handwriting that was not Grace's, heavier, less controlled, the letters pressed into the paper with the urgency of someone writing quickly or writing in fear. "Find me before they do." He read it twice, then he set the photograph down and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. The room held its silence respectfully. "The man," Siwon said. "Her father, Emeka Okafor. He died 14 months ago. Cardiac arrest, official record. He worked for 12 years as a mid-level financial broker for a Seoul-based investment firm called Hanul Capital Partners." Junho paused with the precision of someone allowing the name to land before continuing. "Hanul Capital Partners dissolved 8 months ago. Regulatory complications. The principals scattered. Most of the paper trail dissolved with it." "Most," Siwon said. "Most," Junho confirmed. "We are still working on the rest." Siwon picked up the photograph again and looked at Grace's younger face. Even then, even at 22, in a hospital corridor beside a man who was clearly frightened, she carried that quality he had come to associate with her entirely, that quality of absolute composure that was not the absence of feeling, but was instead the rigorous, practiced management of it. She had learned early, he understood now, how to be still in the middle of something turbulent. She had been doing it long before she ever walked through his gates. "She left it deliberately," he said. It was not a question.
The room was clean, Junho said. Completely clean. No documents, no devices, no personal items. The photograph was the only thing remaining, placed face down on the center of the bare mattress. It was not forgotten. Nothing Grace Okafor does is forgotten. The sentence sat between them with the weight of a shared understanding. Junho had interacted with Grace perhaps a dozen times over the years, brief professional exchanges at the edges of the estate's operations, but even those dozen interactions had been enough. You did not forget Grace Okafor, and you did not mistake her deliberateness for accident. "She left it for someone to find," Siwon said. "She knew the room would be searched eventually. She knew someone would come. It appears she was counting on it." He stood then, moving to the window, and looked out at the estate grounds where the afternoon light had settled into the long gold of early winter. The grounds were immaculate. They had always been immaculate. But he found himself noticing now how the garden nearest the east wall had been quietly restructured at some point in the last year, the hedgerows shaped into a pattern that improved the sightlines from the main house without anyone having requested it. Small, considered, invisible. She had been talking to him for 3 years, he realized, in the reorganized library, in the precise angles of the dining chairs, in the restructured garden, in the perfectly adjusted curtains, in the green tea that was always exactly the right temperature. She had been communicating in the only language she had allowed herself, the language of careful, excellent, unrewarded work. And he had received every message without understanding a single one. Until now, when the messages had stopped and all that remained was a photograph with someone else's handwriting on the back. "Find me before they do." "Hanul Capital Partners," he said, still facing the window. "I want everything, every name connected to its founding, its dissolution, and everything that existed between those 2 points. I want to know who the principals scattered to and where the paper trail was cut.
and I want to know what Emeka Okafor knew before he died that was significant enough for someone to call a cardiac arrest an official cause of death and close the file. Junho was already moving toward the door. One more thing, Siwon said without turning. She's an Itaewon. Junho stopped. We haven't confirmed. She's Nigerian, she's alone, she's working, and she needs to feel grounded while she works. There is a stretch of Itaewon near the Hamilton end where 3 Nigerian restaurants operate within 4 blocks of each other. She would be within walking distance of at least one of them. He paused. Find the one that makes jollof rice. Junho allowed himself the briefest pause. Then, yes, sir. The door closed. Siwon remained at the window, the photograph in his hand, Grace's young, composed face looking back at him from a hospital corridor 14 months before her father died, standing beside a man who already knew that something was coming and had written his fear on the back of a photograph and given it to his daughter to carry. She had carried it for 14 months. She had carried it through 3 years of silence and green tea and perfectly angled curtains. She had carried it alone, and she had managed it the way she managed everything, invisibly, efficiently, without asking a single person for help. He looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he put on his coat.
He found her on a Tuesday evening at 20 minutes past 7 in a room above a restaurant called Mama Titties that smelled of smoked crayfish and palm oil and the particular warmth of a kitchen that has been running since early morning. He had come alone, which was not something he did, in which Park Junho had accepted with the controlled alarm of a man who understood that arguing would cost him more than complying. The street below was alive with the layered noise of Itaewon at dusk, music from 3 different directions, the smell of food from open doorways, languages moving past each other without collision. He had walked from the car without hurrying, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, looking like any other man with somewhere to be. The landlord had not questioned him. People rarely did. He climbed a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor and stood before a door at the end of a short corridor. Light came from beneath it, warm, steady, the light of someone working rather than resting. He could hear, faintly, the sound of papers being moved. He raised his hand and knocked twice, not loudly. The sound of the papers stopped. A long silence. Then Grace's voice, even and careful as he had always known it. "Who is it?" "You already know," he said. Another silence, shorter this time. Then the sound of a lock turning, and the door opened. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, directly, without flinching, without the performance of surprise she did not feel. She was dressed simply, a dark blouse and trousers, her hair natural and unpinned in a way he had never seen it during her years at the estate. She looked both exactly as he remembered and entirely different, the way a place looks different when you see it outside the context you have always associated it with. Behind her, the room told its story without apology. A narrow bed pushed against one wall, a small table completely consumed by stacked documents, printed pages, handwritten notes connected by lines she had drawn herself, a laptop open to a spreadsheet dense with figures, and on the corner of the table, a bowl of jollof rice that had gone cold and untouched. She stepped back from the door without a word. He entered. He did not look at the documents immediately, though he was aware of them the way he was aware of everything in a room, cataloging without appearing to catalog, filing without appearing to file. He looked at her instead, and she let him, standing with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable because it was the same silence they had always occupied together, the silence of 2 people who had learned, in proximity, that words were not always the most precise instrument. "You left the photograph," he said. "I left it for whoever came first," she said. "I hoped it would be you." He absorbed that. Why? She moved to the table and sat down in the chair before the documents, not to create distance, but because it was where she had been and it was where the conversation needed to happen. He remained standing, which was also where the conversation needed him.
My father worked for Hanuel Capital Partners for 12 years, she began, and her voice carried the steady quality of someone who has rehearsed a confession, not to make it easier, but to make it accurate. For most of those years, he believed he was doing legitimate financial work, portfolio management, regional investment structuring. He was good at it. In his last 2 years, he began to understand that portions of the capital he was moving were not what they were documented to be. Money was entering the firm's accounts from sources that did not exist on paper and leaving through channels that dissolved immediately after each transaction. She paused. He was not a criminal. He was a man who had been made into a useful instrument by people who were very good at selecting useful instruments. He gathered evidence, Siwan said. For 11 months before he died, yes, quietly, carefully. He gave it to me piece by piece because he knew that keeping it together in one place made it a target. When he died, she stopped, began again. When he died, I had the pieces, but not the complete picture. I needed access to financial records that were not publicly available. I needed proximity to a world where those records moved. The room was very still. You came to work for me, Siwan said slowly, because my name opened doors that yours could not. Your name, she said, kept certain people from looking too closely at mine. For 3 years, I was Grace Okafor, head maid of Jian Siwan's estate. No one with an interest in finding me looked there. And from within that position, I was able, carefully and over time, to access the peripheral financial networks I needed to reconstruct what my father had documented. He was quiet for a long moment. You finished. 3 days ago. I have the complete picture now. Every transaction, every false entity, every name. She looked at him steadily. That is why I left when I did. I had what I came for, and staying any longer would have made you a liability in ways you didn't deserve. People were beginning to look, if they had found me at your estate. You were protecting the house, he said. It was not quite a question. It landed between them as a recognition, the specific recognition of a man who has just understood something that has been true for a long time, understanding it too late and too completely at once. I was protecting you, she said, with the same simplicity she had brought to everything else she had ever done for him. No drama, no decoration, just the plain, accurate statement of a fact she had lived quietly for 3 years. He moved to the table then and looked at the documents for the first time, not at their content, but at their arrangement. Even here, even in a rented room above a restaurant in Itaewon, working alone on something that cost her 3 years and her father's life, she had organized everything with that same precise, considered intelligence. Every page had its place. Every connection was marked clearly. It was, he understood, a complete case, the kind of meticulous, irrefutable documentation that did not ask to be believed, but simply demonstrated the truth and waited for the appropriate response. His eyes moved across the names on the topmost page. He read them with the practiced speed of a man accustomed to processing information quickly. He read them until he reached a name near the bottom of the 3rd column, a name he knew, a name he had trusted, a name that had sat across from him at his own table and eaten his food and offered counsel and smiled the smile of a trusted man for 4 of the last 7 years. He did not react, not outwardly, but Grace was watching him with the attention of someone who had spent 3 years learning to read his silences, and she saw what moved through him, brief, tightly controlled, and then gone, replaced by the stillness that was his most honest expression. You knew it was someone inside, he said. I knew before the end of my 1st year, she said quietly. It is why I stayed the full 3. I needed the connection between him and the network to be undeniable. 1 year's evidence could be argued. 3 years cannot. He looked at her then, fully, without the professional remove that had structured every interaction they had ever had in his estate. She met his gaze with the same directness she had always carried, the same composure, but there was something else in it now. the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding something enormous alone for a very long time and has finally, in this small room above a warm kitchen, set it down in the presence of someone capable of carrying it forward. On the table between them, 3 years of her life, her father's final act of courage, and the name of a man who had betrayed everything he had been trusted to protect. Outside, Itaewon moved through its evening, indifferent and luminous. Siwon reached out and placed his hand flat on the documents, not taking them, not moving them, simply acknowledging them the way you acknowledge something that has cost more than it should have had to cost. He looked at Grace Adeze Okafor, who had walked into his world with a secret and a grief and a mission and had served him, genuinely and without complaint, for every single day of the 3 years it took her to complete it. Then John Siwon, who had never in his life chased anyone, who had built an empire on the principle that nothing left without his permission and nothing ended without his decision, said the only thing that was left to say. "You should have told me," he said quietly. "I would have helped you carry it." And that, right there, is where everything changed. Not with a war, not with a threat, not with the cold, calculated power that had built his empire brick by brick over 11 years, but with 7 quiet words from the most untouchable man in Seoul. "I would have helped you carry it." Grace Adeze Okafor had walked into his world with a grief so heavy it had reshaped her entire life. She had served in silence, moved in silence, sacrificed in silence, and in the end, she had won in silence too. But now the silence was different. Now it held something neither of them had names for yet. And the man whose name sat at the bottom of that 3rd column, the trusted man, the smiling man, the man who had eaten at Siwon's table and called himself loyal, he did not yet know that everything was about to collapse around him. He would, very soon. This is not the end of Grace and Siwon's story. It is only the beginning. If this story held you from the first second to the last, tell me, in the comments, did you suspect the insider? Who did you think it was?